We're there. Good afternoon,
Okay,
everybody. My name is John Dennehy, and on behalf of all at the Bussola Institute in Brussels, it is my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar on the topic of COVID-19 and its impact on EU-GCC-Asia connectivity. Last October, the Bussola Institute held a joint seminar on the topic of EU-GCC-Asia connectivity in partnership with the EU-Asia Centre in Brussels, when we explored the changing geopolitical situation of the Gulf states and their potential role in the various connectivity strategies linking Europe and Asia. And given its strategic location between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and its abundant energy resources, the Gulf region clearly has an important and pivotal role to play regarding China's Belt and Road Initiative and the EU's own connectivity strategy linking Europe and Asia. Despite occupying this key position, we're of the view that insufficient attention has been paid to the role of the Gulf in promoting Euro-Asian connectivity. And as part of our discussion during last October's seminar, we looked closely at the existing connectivity and planned cooperation between the GCC, the EU, and Asia across a number of areas critical to this agenda, including energy, ports, transport links, data, and people-to-people connectivity. In continuing our examination of this theme, Bussola published a complementary paper last February entitled Connectivity Between the Gulf Cooperation Council and Asia, which was authored by Dr. Guy Burton. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Guy as one of our distinguished panelists here today, and I look forward to his updated assessment of GCC-Asia connectivity, which has been moving beyond the traditional energy dimension to a more complex set of exchanges involving investment in construction, in infrastructure, healthcare, financial services, and in greater security cooperation. In light of the unprecedented upheaval the world has witnessed since the beginning of 2020, arising from COVID-19 pandemic, we at the Bussola Institute felt that it was an opportune moment to pick up the discussion again on the issue of EU-GCC-Asia connectivity and to revisit some of the issues we had previously discussed in light of the current circumstances and their wider implications. The GCC states have been impacted directly by the COVID-19 pandemic, resulting in the sudden collapse of oil exports to the surging Asian economies, while new and fundamental questions have been raised with regard to global supply chains and the associated medium to long-term economic impact for the GCC-Asia relationship. In Europe, the 2020 Strategic Agenda for Cooperation commits the EU and China to developing a more balanced economic relationship. But how will the growing assertiveness of China and the fallout from COVID-19 impact on effective and coherent engagement with the Asian economies? The key question that we'd like to explore in today's seminar is how COVID-19 is impacting on relations between the EU, the GCC states, and Asia, and what that means for connectivity overall. In this context, does it make sense to pursue a more coordinated approach between the GCC and the EU when it comes to future relations with Asia? And if it does, how should the EU and GCC structure their relationship to accommodate the different economic, social, and political dimensions involved? To examine and discuss this topic further, we are very pleased to have three excellent speakers with us today, each one of them with a wide breadth of knowledge and deep experience in this area. They will help to bring us some context and better understanding to the new situation that has emerged. I will introduce each speaker in turn just before that person speaks. In the meantime, just to remind you to put any questions you may have in the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to get to some of them, or as many of them as we can, within the fairly tight time constraints that we're working in. Our first speaker today, and I'm not going to go through the speakers' biographies, you have them, they were sent to you, is Dr. Guy Burton. And Guy is a young professor in international affairs at Versailles College in Brussels, and has a very checkered and hugely experienced career. Guy will speak on the key findings of his Bussola paper and bring those findings into line with the recent developments of the COVID-19 pandemic and its potential consequences. Over to you, Guy, and you're most welcome.
Thank you very much, John. That's a very kind introduction, and also thank you for Christian, for both of you for hosting us here, us all at Bussola. In the sort of the 8 to 10 minutes that I have, I just wanted to maybe recap some of the key points of the report that what came out in February, and then provide with that, so then move on a little bit to, well, how has this impacted the relationship between the Gulf and Asia since COVID-19 first emerged on our radar, really around sort of March. And then I guess if I still have a little bit of time at the end, just to sort of look ahead for what this might mean for European policymakers. So the first point that I want to make about the report, and it is available, it's available on the Bussola on the website, so certainly you can read it in a bit more detail, but I just want to sort of capture the essence of what went into it when it was published pre-COVID-19. And the main point that I want to make about the report is that really the relationship that is emerging between the Gulf countries and Asia is a much more complex and a diverse one than we might normally imagine. I mean, typically about 20 or 30 years ago, the primary points of contact with through trade in the hydrocarbon sector, with the Gulf states as the primary producers and Asian countries as the consumers. But this is actually just one aspect of a relationship that is becoming a lot more diverse, that includes a wider range of economic connection and interaction, and also is starting to develop into the security sector as well, thinking in terms of regional security. So the main points I want to just say about the report are that it looks at it looks at the largest countries in more detail. So from the Gulf side, it's looking at Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, because those have the larger larger economies. And then from the Asian side, it's really drawing on sort of the experience of China, India, Japan, and Korea as sort of the four larger economies in that part of the world. If we look at trade itself, and obviously I alluded to hydrocarbons as being sort of the primary point of contact that we usually think about, what you have there is, over the last 20 years, a growing trade surplus by Gulf states in relation to Japan and India. But on the other side, when it comes to China and to a lesser extent Korea, we see a trade deficit. So certainly, China still remains a really important destination for oil and gas to China, but it also is becoming a key recipient of Chinese imports. Now, moving on from trade, I think trade is important, but then I think investment is also really significant here. And so what we're seeing is, again, a two-way relationship emerging. Obviously, we've got the importance that exist from the Gulf, the PIF in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth funds are also significantly. And now, typically in the past, they have focused on investments within the developed economies, those in North America and Europe. But what we've seen is that there's, especially since 2008-9, the financial crisis then, more focus on investment into Asia, partly because the returns are a little bit faster there and sharper. And we've also seen it diversifying into a wider range of sectors, to include property, petroleum development, as well as high-tech sectors. So you'll often find, as well as the development of sort of the renewable industry for energy, as well as in terms of artificial intelligence and big data. Now, also, as I said, it is a two-way relationship, two-way process that's going on in terms of investments. And so what you have is, investments from the Asian side, from East Asia towards the Gulf. And of course, when we think about China, the most notable and obvious one of there is the Belt and Road Initiative. A number of those countries that are most influenced and affected by this would be primarily sort of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who are sort of, China's main trading partners. But you also see that the Indian government has started to pay a lot more attention in the last 10 to 15 years in the Middle East, and especially in the Gulf. There is a number of things there. You have obviously a significantly large, migrant population, but also you're seeing investments by Indian companies into the region as well. And of course, there is obviously Korea and Japan, which historically have had financial and construction infrastructure work going on there. Now, moving into the final part of the report, we start to look at security cooperation. And certainly there has been sort of some discussion as to whether the United States is in retreat from the Middle East more generally. While that may well be the case, it's possible. I think it's important to not overstate it and to remember that the Gulf states do still continue to rely and work with and collaborate with the United States on security issues, not least because of their regional threat coming from Iran. They've also started to diversify those relationships, and that's why you see efforts to try and interact and collaborate with actors like the Chinese and the Indians in that respect. And we've also seen sort of the establishment of sort of greater security partnerships in relation to that. Now, moving on, obviously, sort of since February, March, we've had the emergence of COVID-19, and so what impact does this have on the relationship between the Gulf and Asia? Broadly, I mean, there are three possibilities that could emerge. One is that there is no change; everything will look pretty much the same as it is now. Or on the other end of the spectrum, that it's going to completely transform the relationship. I would just say it's probably more likely to be somewhere in between, an exacerbation of the current trends, maybe some shifts, within that relationship. And if we look at some of the data that's been coming out from some of the international organizations that are concerned with this, we see a sort of a range of possible options between sort of the pessimistic and the optimistic. What we need to take into account, of course, is that COVID itself, 54% of the cases at the moment, have in the Middle East have happened in the Gulf states, and there is still an ongoing process of restrictions, lockdown, social distancing. There's even the possible suspension of the Hajj in Saudi Arabia. There's also efforts to try and sort of incentivize working from home and benefits and assistance to some of the populations, or at least the national populations in the region. There's also a discussion going on as to whether COVID-19 might actually contribute to the diversification strategies that a number of these Gulf countries have had. For example, Vision 2020 in Saudi Arabia, Agenda 2030 in the UAE. It's certainly, we can talk in maybe more detail about that, because given pressing time, I just want to move on to sort of the final point in the last couple of minutes that I have, which is sort of what are the implications for European policymakers. I think as I pointed out, COVID-19 is not going to completely transform the nature of the relationship. Neither is it going to see a sort of a complete reversal. So what this means is that what we have seen as a progressive development, diversification, and expansion of economic and security related ties will continue between the Gulf states and Asia. Maybe not at the same pace, maybe it might take a bit of a slowdown as to before, but that means that European policymakers are going to need to take into account that this is the state of affairs. They're going to have to work with that. That means that there will be both opportunities and challenges that are presented there. Obviously, the slowdown in economic trade and investment means that the possibilities of sort of being able to attract Gulf sovereign wealth funding in Europe might be less these days, but there will also be opportunities potentially for investment within the Gulf. We're seeing, for example, already discussion about austerity starting to happen in some of the Gulf states, a cutback on public spending, especially as there's going to be significant public deficits after this year. So there may well be an opportunity for European firms and businesses, to step in and to provide, business opportunities and services there. Although, of course, services themselves may be more affected than things like, non-manufacturing related activities, partly because of the restrictions on travel and transport. Of course, we're going to need to take into account that, the nature of the relationships that are emerging, these in some respects, and especially if we look in the realm of security, it's often the case that these relationships that the Gulf states are having with Asian states are often quite transactional in nature. So they focus on what needs to be dealt with, in the here and now, but also trying to make sure that those relationships do not spill over into other areas. So, for example, you will see, a number of the Gulf states do still maintain this security arrangement and alliance with the United States. Similarly, so with East Asian countries like Japan and Korea, and to a lesser extent, India. Now, of course, we having to fit China into all of that. What you see, for example, is of course these Gulf states, keen to, attract and encourage, Chinese investment and interaction, and also possibly even at the security level. But always these states tend to recognize that there is only a limit so that they can go to. So whereas those who've been following, sort of the American pressure on Israel, for example, to make a choice between the US or China, I think that kind of pressure that we may well see from the United States will not have the same kind of extreme reaction, because there is, to some degree, the Gulf states have not put all of their cards in with the United States, as, say, for example, the Israelis have. I think I've probably reached the limit of my time there, so I'll cut it now, and I'll be happy to take questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Guy, for a hugely informative and engaging presentation, as you always do. I've had you speak before many times. We now move to Hasan, and I am most grateful to Hasan Alhasan for finding the time to work with us today, because Hasan is in the middle of a PhD at King's College in London, which is not an easy task, as we've been chatting before this webinar. And prior to this, Hasan worked as a senior analyst in the office of the First Deputy Minister of the Kingdom of Bahrain. Hasan will center his remarks today on the Arab Gulf states' views on the Belt and Road Initiative, how it impacts them, in addition to how the GCC use their own geo-economic tools to entice China. Thanks a lot, Hasan, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure, John. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So as you suggested, I will not be dwelling on the trade or investment patterns, because Guy has spoken very eloquently on those, and I think his report, that it was an excellent scene setter, because it really establishes the economic, including trade and investment context, in which many of these dynamics that I'm going to be describing on the political and geopolitical level for the Gulf states. So what I will do is I will try to expand on the implications of the economic patterns that Guy has described, and specifically in a political and geopolitical sense, as far as the Gulf states' relationships with China are concerned. And I will do those in a very classical fashion, looking at the domestic politics level of the Gulf states, how China's investment and economic activity is perceived there, proceeding then to discuss the bilateral level in terms of China GCC, and then more broadly, how the China-GCC relationship affects the GCC states' relationships with other regional and global players, including specifically Iran on the one hand, and the US on the other, all while trying to be brief and succinct. To begin with, I think on the domestic political level, the short answer there is that we don't have a lot of data on how China is perceived within the GCC. There are some indicators. So, for example, the Arab Barometer has released its fifth wave of findings that covers the period between 2018 and 2019. Unfortunately, the GCC countries are not very well represented in that report. We have Kuwait from the GCC and Iraq as a Gulf littoral country. As far as these two countries are concerned, at least according to the Arab Barometer, in Kuwait, for example, China comes out as the second most popular country, where 49% of Kuwaiti respondents were in favor of stronger economic relations, just after Saudi Arabia. And then in Iraq, China comes actually on top with 51% advocating stronger economic relations and 57% advocating more foreign aid coming in from China. So as far as these results from the Arab Barometer are concerned, it seems that China is not faring too poorly as far as the domestic political public perception of itself within at least Kuwait and Iraq. Unfortunately, the survey doesn't cover the rest of the Gulf states, so we don't know. Now, that being said, it's very difficult, I think, to draw definitive conclusions from these what I would call very preliminary results. I think, for one thing, we're not entirely sure yet of how salient China is as an issue. Although China might, be popular to some extent, to what extent do people really care? How many people answered don't know or don't really care as far as the China question is concerned? I think the second issue is that when we look at public opinion research in general, for decades, it's quite a tricky area of study. For decades, even in the US, a very vibrant democracy, for decades, people thought that public opinion didn't really matter as far as policymaking was concerned. And it really took decades upon decades of panel studies, panel data, to shed light on the subtle ways to develop a more complete understanding of how public opinion intertwines and affects policymaking. The point is that in the GCC context, this data does not exist. We don't have overlapping studies of public opinion that go back decades. So in a sense, I mean, these results on China could very well be ephemeral. Public opinion on China and the Gulf could be extremely volatile. And in that sense, China might not even be a salient issue. And so it might not even, we may not be even able to talk about a public perception per se in China, of China and the GCC state. So what I'm saying is that this is a big question mark. We don't know yet. We don't have the data to draw definitive conclusions on China's perception, on the perception of China within the GCC. That being said, I think it's there have been, we can already see the challenges from the domestic politics of the GCC for China's investments. My friends Mohammed al-Sideri and Al-Anud al-Sabah have published a wonderful case study of the Silk City project in Kuwait and China's involvement in that. And you can see how, because of the vagaries and complexities of Kuwait's domestic politics, on the one hand, the project itself went through multiple iterations and restructuring and so on. But then we saw quite a bit of domestic political resistance to the project because of its extra-constitutional, extraterritorial nature, and how that ended up with changes in Kuwait's political leadership at the prime ministerial level, how that ended up stalling the project quite a bit. So I think the Silk City is one illustration of how domestic politics in the GCC could end up dampening or hampering China's economic presence in the region. Moving on to the bilateral level of China-GCC relations or China-Gulf relations, I think that at the elite level, elite perceptions of China tend to be positive. And I think the indications for that are the strategic partnerships that China has in the region with the UAE, with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, at various levels. And I think these suggest that relations on the elite level between the Gulf states and China are, I think, largely good and well. And I think this is partly because of the fact that the GCC and the Gulf states as a whole have largely steered away from China's red lines, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Xinjiang. And I think these have contributed to the sound functioning of the relationships on the bilateral level so far. Now, despite US pressure, I think the Gulf states haven't come to perceive Chinese investments and economic activity as a security threat. I don't think that they share the American perception as far as that is concerned. We've seen an openness to Huawei being I think, the most emblematic and hotly debated topic. Of course, Huawei does not have a monopoly on 5G infrastructure in the Gulf. Gulf telecom operators have also been open to Huawei competitors, but they have also welcomed Huawei into the market. I think this partly stems from a difference in perception, but I think it also reflects the economic reality that Gulf states are much less likely to be at risk of falling into a Chinese debt trap, so to speak. Perhaps the sole exception somewhat being Oman, because of its rising public debt levels and its fiscal difficulties. Although I think even then it's really a moderate risk. We're also seeing an expansion of ties in the defense industrial sector. Guy alluded to this very quickly. Beijing has been picking up where the US has left off. Drones obviously are one widely discussed example, with the Chinese potentially setting up a manufacturing and service facility in Saudi Arabia, the third outside of China and the first in the Middle East. That being said, I think there still is a general preference for US arms and US systems, partly because of legacy issues, interoperability issues, trust, training. The US has been the GCC's largest supplier of arms for a very long time. The US, as a matter of fact, has expanded its market share of GCC arms procurements between 2015 and 2019. But nevertheless, the Gulf states have a very large appetite for military and arms procurement, and Beijing has been able to leave its mark, especially in the areas of UAVs, but also artificial intelligence and so on that might have military applications. I think finally, as far as how China's rise affects the GCC states or the Gulf states' relations with other regional and global powers, I think on the regional level with Iran, it's clear that China is not wanting to take sides in the GCC-Iran rivalry. I think we saw this very clearly in the aftermath of the Iranian attacks on the oil tankers and the Gulf waters, but also the Iranian attacks on Saudi Aramco and the oil facilities. China, but actually most of the big Asian players, completely avoided pointing the finger at Iran, not wanting to be seen as part of the GCC-Iran rivalry, and partly because I think they attribute much of these security tensions to the US's withdrawal from the JCPOA and tend to interpret it within this wider context. That said, there's been a lot of speculation about what China will do once the UN arms embargo is lifted on Iran. Will China become one of Iran's arms suppliers? I think that it has the potential to do so. I don't think that I think China is too big to be constrained by the GCC states' desire not for China not to supply arms to Iran. I don't think China will constrain itself. I think if China is selling arms to one party, I think from a perspective of from the on the logic of decoupling and so on, I think it will see itself as having every excuse to supply arms to the other side. So I think China will probably fuel the regional arms conflict. I don't think it will be constrained in its relationship with Iran by its relationship with the GCC states. Finally, on as far as how the GCC China relationship is concerned, how China affects the US GCC relationship. I just wrote an op-ed on this in the Asia Times that came out yesterday. I think that US pressure on GCC countries to shun Chinese investments has been unsuccessful. I think it will continue probably to remain unsuccessful. Against the conventional view that China's rise will prompt the US to shift its focus away from the Gulf and more towards the Indo-Pacific region. Yes, the US is going to focus on the Indo-Pacific region. It's going to be obviously focused on containing China's rise. But I argue that the GCC states are a key part of that puzzle. China is still extremely dependent on the Gulf region for its energy supplies, which means that by maintaining a military presence there, the US can strategically move in to block China from obtaining this vital and strategic asset. Oman is obviously very well located as a pivotal player in the maritime game within the Indian Ocean. So I think the US will probably look at how it can, US strategists at least, I think will be interested in looking at how they could leverage relations with the GCC states to contain China's rise. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Hasan, for what was a most eloquent and indeed enlightening presentation. And we're very grateful to you. And I would also like just to comment very briefly on the op-ed that Hasan mentioned in yesterday's Asia Times. And the title of it is "To Counter China's Rise, US Still Needs Its Gulf Allies." Very interesting for any of you who would be interested in looking it up. And finally, Hasan, the very best of luck with your PhD. And thank you very, very much again for taking the time to spend it with us this morning. I'd now like to move on to our final speaker, Tobias Gehrke. And Tobias is a research fellow in the Europe in the World program at the prestigious Egmont Institute in Brussels. And his research centers on geo-economics, global economic governance, and the strategic use of trade, investment, and regulatory policy by the EU and the great powers, all of which we're going to need very, very much in the months and years ahead, I'm afraid. Tobias will focus on the economic security dimension of the EU connectivity debate. Thank you very much, Tobias.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Christian, and my fellow panelists. You know, I'm also in the final year of my PhD, so I feel the pain and the sweat of Hasan.
And we wish you the same amount of luck as we wish to Hasan. So.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I want to start. I mean, there's a lot of detail that we can talk about economic security and connectivity. So I want to use the couple of minutes that I have to focus on the broader evolving thinking behind connectivity that I think is taking place in Europe, but certainly also many other places. And that is that I think that we passed sort of a peak of understanding of connectivity, or more broadly speaking, globalization, being understood as ever closer economic integration across all sectors of the economy, broadly speaking, or ever closer opening up of economies as sort of the main goal. Rather, I think policymakers become increasingly cautious in Europe also about connectivity, asking questions like, how are we dependent on others in certain critical sectors? Are there risky bottlenecks in our trade networks and our investment networks that might be risky? And that is clearly one outcome or one development of the COVID-19 crisis in the early months of when it came to Europe, and in February, March. I think European states faced really supply shortages of medical equipment, of PPE, of medicines, of pharmaceutical inputs that couldn't come to Europe because the supply was disrupted. Primarily because supplies, it turned out, was quite centralized in very specific bottlenecks, where certain firms in China were really dominating the market, and if supply was disrupted, these medical goods could not come to Europe in a time of crisis. Also within Europe, there was supply shortages across European member states, which was quite tenuous. But I think that episode really got policymakers thinking that certain critical supplies of the European states are really precarious, actually, when a crisis hits. But I think it's not only a crisis. Of course, now the health crisis really showed this in particular when supply was disrupted. But I think we're observing this trend actually for a couple of years already, where it's not maybe a health pandemic, but it's also states and powers who, sort of weaponize these dependencies that third states might have on them as a form of statecraft. And that is, of course, a millennial-old statecraft. States have been doing this for many years, particularly in energy, for instance, and so on. But I think what's new is that in the past year, states are more experimenting with some of these economic networks that they have between themselves, for instance, access to finance or access to technology, access or flow of investment and other raw materials that you might need for digital technologies like minerals or chemicals for semiconductors. And so here states have, like the United States, China, but also Japan, Russia and so on, have become more active in exploring how they can leverage these supply chains, these interdependencies they have for geopolitical credit. And so these two things together, states being more active in leveraging these dependencies, but also in combination with this COVID-19 crisis, I think we observed that many governments or policymakers try to become more active in this debate. Okay, hang on, how do we actually secure our economic security? That is to say, they asked themselves, I think, several questions. One is, does my government need to be more involved or maybe even intervene in some of these economic networks in order to ensure that we're not dependent in a times of crisis, that something like happened in March or February does not happen again? That question alone is already a very bureaucratic question for governments, I think, because often we do not, at least not in Europe, not have the capacity to actually answer these kind of questions, because trade and investment policy is done by people in trade and investment policy, and people who ask more security questions are the people in foreign policy, national security. We do not really have platforms where these people come together and debate this newly emerging issue of economic security. So I think here's already first process how we can get different stakeholders together to debate these new topics. Secondly, I think governments also asking themselves, well, okay, what kind of sectors, what kind of goods are actually critical, are actually strategic? It's quite obvious maybe in some of these health products that are necessary in a crisis. But what else is there? Do we need to have some sort of list? Do we need to have some sort of strategic text, some strategic networks where we might need more active government involvement? And here I think also the European Union is beginning a process where we're expanding this kind of list, this kind of thinking from very traditional topics like energy or raw materials or food security, which has always been, I think, on policymakers' minds to make sure that we're secure access to these. But now I think there's quite an expanding debate that we're saying, okay, hang on, what about digital infrastructure, the whole 5G Huawei debate? What about cloud computing, these new technologies? Do we need some sort of our own Gaia X, which was just launched in Europe? Do we need our own infrastructure? What about other transformative tech, AI, robotics, renewable energy tech, ICT infrastructure? Again, I think there's a very messy process at the moment, and we're far from it, but the development is that policymakers really thinking about, categorizing certain strategic technologies that might be treated differently from trade in bananas or trade in textile and so on, where maybe quite obviously there's not a risk to the security of European people. And thirdly, I think they're asking themselves how, if we have these things established, how can we actually cooperate and coordinate with the private business? That's really a difficult part, I think, because the private business are the ones who are chiefly trading internationally. They are building supply chains and production sites all around the world that are governed by rules of efficiency. And it is not in the interest of governments to disrupt these. These companies need to stay competitive. So I think it's very difficult and a very long-term task that we're going to be engaged in the next 5 years, I think. How governments can coordinate with businesses to say, yes, we want to be efficient, we need to be competitive, but at the same time, we need to think about resilience, as we call it here in Europe. Well, we need to be secure, in other words. And again, I think that's a very difficult thing to do. And we see that governments, not only in Europe, but also the United States and Japan, are struggling with this, wanting to do something, but actually it's quite difficult to get this done when private business is in the lead. Finally, just what policies are European countries, but also other countries adopting in this new economic security frame? I think quite a lot. I think many things would fall under this. And one way to distinguish maybe some of the policies, for me at least, is to really distinguish into two categories of economic security. One is protective policies or defensive policies. So here, really, let's say the aim is to defend against opportunistic or hostile foreign actors, so they don't undermine the economic or even the national security of the EU market. So for instance, there's a lot of debate for already 2 years in Europe about investment screening. We're also discussing more and more about export controls. What kind of technology do we maybe have to control better? Of course, what is the regulation? What is the scope of critical infrastructure? Again, Huawei, but this of course extends into cloud computing, etc. And other regulatory instruments, and competition policy, trade instruments, etc. Secondly, though, there's still, of course, this the other category where I think I would categorize that as promotional policies. So that is really still to say, okay, we might be, if we are dependent in certain for certain goods, for certain technologies, or inputs into strategic technologies, the best way to decrease that dependence is to diversify our supply, so that if China or any other country might be weaponizing this their supply, we still have a different supplier, and for that, essentially, we need more open trade policy, more investment in trade policies, agreements with partner countries. We need to actually develop more and more regions, opening their markets, so we can also strategically target certain developments of, for instance, pharmaceutical inputs that you need. Maybe you can have strategic investments and trend policy in a region, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, to help them build that capacity that we also would have benefits from, that we have more supplies from all over the world. And I think that's the debate that will be coming back quite a lot in the next years. The defensive debate is, I think, quite strong at the moment, but really the next year it's about this promotional debate. It's about, okay, connectivity, connectivity or an open policy that is more thinking more actively about these things that we actually need, these resiliences that we need to implement, and with what kind of partners and in what kind of regions do we want to develop and partner up. And yeah, there's more detail, of course, into this, but maybe I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for indeed a very clear and focused presentation. And I would now like to hand over to call on my colleague, Dr. Christian Koch, who is our Senior Advisor and Director of Research, to moderate the Q&A session, which unfortunately, as always is the case, will not be over long. Christian was centrally involved in last October's connectivity seminar in Bussola. So over to you, Christian, for the quick Q&A.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for the three interventions. You provided some very insightful analysis here, and I think we have about 15 minutes, and we can pick up on some of the issues that have been mentioned. Luckily, we've only had one question sort of posed in the questions and answer chat box, and it's not directly related to the topic at hand here, but I'll throw it out, and if anybody of you wants to come in and comment, I'll please do so. And that's in relation, of course, to the most recent developments since yesterday of this clash between India and China and what impact that might have overall. But I'll leave that a little bit on the side, and if you want to come in your comments, you're welcome to do so. Given the 15 minutes, let me just pose a question to sort of each of you. I'll start with Guy. In your paper that you wrote for the Bussola Institute last year, you did speak a little bit about the transformative economic ties happening here. Now, in light of the developments that, in connection with COVID and the COVID-19 pandemic, and also a little bit to the debates that Tobias was just mentioning in terms of economic security. Just one example being this focus now on more local supply chains overall. Do you still see the GCC-Asia economic relationship being so transformative? Are there issues there that are going to come into the debate that might change the parameters a little bit, slow down maybe a little bit of the focus? Or do you see that just being, there are too many factors here that are simply supportive of a continuing expansive relationship with Asia on economic ties? How do you see that? You want to come in on? You just need, yeah.
Do you want me to come in right now?
Please.
Do you want to sort of pose the questions? I mean, otherwise, fine. I think just to sort of be very, very brief about it, my hunch, my feeling is that what you're going to see is just, COVID-19 won't completely, it won't reset things. It will just sort of maybe set things back a little bit. Maybe, that maybe the degree of investment, the degree of trade will slow down a little bit. But what you're also seeing, I think, is an awareness on both sides, both amongst Gulf states as well as amongst Asian states, to diversify. So we've seen, for example, the Indians and the Chinese in recent years, and especially now, have been looking to diversify their oil supplies. So, to buy from different suppliers. Similarly, what I think you're seeing on the Gulf side, obviously there will be less investment now because they need, the governments are going to need to use their sovereign wealth funds, for example, to compensate for the slight economic downturn. But that's what sovereign wealth funds are for, right? They're there for, as to be used on a rainy day. But what we may well see, I think, looking at sort of OECD, projections, they've sort of said, things might be, the pessimistic outlook is that investment FDI does not come back in a great way until the end of next year. The more optimistic ones say that they might start to restart, later this year. But what I think we're going to see is continuation of, some continuation of sort of the trade and investment. Some areas are going to do better than others. So, for example, as you know, in the Gulf, there has been sort of a move away from sort of the hydrocarbons to diversifying into the services industry a lot more. One area which may well be receive a lot more attention in the coming years is going to be the healthcare system sector, of which the UAE has been particularly prominent in that regard. I think what's also interesting is that the International Energy Agency, which has been monitoring sort of the impact of COVID-19 on energy usage, we've seen big falls in terms of coal, which is not obviously a Gulf product, but also big falls in oil and gas. But where there has been an increase has been in the renewables sector. And as you know, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others are looking to diversify into to expand on renewable energy production for the future. And that is an area, for example, where the Chinese have been very enthusiastic to get involved. Part of the Arab policy paper of 2016 talked about diversifying, their economic interactions beyond just, hydrocarbons. So renewables is an area that you'll see more of. So I think what you're going to see is maybe just a slight slowdown, but sort of a rejigging and a refocus. Also, if you want to take India, for example, as well, one of the recent things of the COVID-19 has been, sort of the countries in the Gulf wanting to see that India repatriate its nationals. They've been doing that, but I don't think we're going to see any kind of, ending of Indian migrant labor in the Gulf. That will return. Demand and supply requires that that these countries, need to have jobs filled, and they're not going to. And even if you were to use, max out, local indigenous labor, there will still be spots left over, and those will be filled by Indians and others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. No, excellent on that. Hasan, let me bring you in on this. I want to pick up on one of the things that you talked about. That was, that elite perceptions in the Gulf tend to be quite positive towards China. And I'll couple that a little bit with my colleague Angus's question that was posted in the section here on, given the arguably reckless approach in the US to the threat posed by COVID-19, which contrasts with China's much more disciplined and arguably more responsible approach. Does that really mean that we might have, what's the discourse now in the Gulf states on this, on the relationship with China, on the reliability of China? Is there a discussion in the region about this, looking more favorably towards China, or the more traditional relationship that the region has always had more with the United States and the West? Where do you see the discourse at the moment in the region developing?
Great, thank you very much, Christian. I think it's. I think I must nuance the statement that elite, while elite perceptions are, I think, fairly positive of China, and that it is a useful partner that usually has a no strings attached policy to its dealings. I think on the one, on the other hand, these perceptions tend to be quite, in a sense, shallow and transactional, in the sense that China does not yet enjoy a profound cultural presence in the region, the way, for example, some of the Western and North American and European countries do, or even other Asian countries such as India, right? So what I'm trying to say is that Gulf elites still don't send their children to be educated in China. They still don't seek healthcare in China. They don't speak Mandarin. They don't spend their holidays in China for the most part. They do a lot of that in the West, and even in other countries such as India, for example, partly because of the old historical ties and the presence of a large population. That being said, I don't think there is much of a discourse on how COVID-19 has and whether or not it has an impact on Gulf GCC relations. We've seen China engaging in public health diplomacy, sending supplies to some of the Gulf states. But I think that has barely scratched the surface of public discourse in the Gulf. On the popular level, I think, some of the rhetoric that we've seen coming out of the US, describing this as the Wuhan virus and so on, that has had an impact. People have been slightly resentful on the popular level, but that has not translated, I think, into a sustained elite level policy discourse on what that means. I think on the elite level, I think there is an understanding that pandemics do happen. They've come out of Spain in the past. They're coming out of China now. I mean, these things do happen, and I think there is a certain level of acceptance of the fact that we need to move beyond this, and that China remains a potentially useful partner for the Gulf states. I'll just say that as far as the investment patterns and economic patterns are concerned, and how COVID-19 might have an impact on these, I think, yes, of course, COVID-19 has slowed everything down almost across the board as far as economic activity is concerned. It's likely to have a dampening effect on China's BRI project in the region. Some of these projects have already, I believe, been put on hold. We've heard the Emiratis trying to be, speaking in a reassuring tone on this. That being said, it will be interesting to see whether COVID-19 has a differential impact amongst the different states of the Middle East as far as Chinese investments are concerned. What I'm trying to say is that, for example, Chinese investments took quite a hit after the 2011 Arab Spring events in Libya, for example. Now, the question is, will the Chinese be looking more at the Gulf states as safe, reliable investment partners in a post-COVID world, where because of slower Chinese economic growth, because of shrinking foreign currency reserves, because of the need to focus on domestic economic development, China will be more selective in the way that it deploys its financial capital, the way it deploys its investments in the region, and thereby privileging the Gulf states as safe, reliable investment partners. These patterns, I think, are going to be interesting to see. It's going to be interesting to see how they pan out and play out once we're out of the bottleneck.
Yeah, excellent. I tend to completely agree with you. It'd be interesting to keep an eye on these developments and watch into the direction the debate might take. Tobias, also bring you in on this a little bit on the, where do you see the European debate on the front of China? We've seen in the last few weeks the whole question about the disinformation campaigns, about supplies being used sort of in public relations campaign. And I also want to link that, the perceptions of inside Europe on China, link that to Mohammed Baharoun's question a little bit, whether you see the EU actually taking a side in this sort of Cold War that is coming up here between the US and China, and what impact that might have overall. Where do you see this debate inside Europe?
Yes, maybe I can put this into three sub-questions. First of all, I think the EU is very much, there's no one position on China. Not only is there quite some disagreement among member states, or from Germany to Italy or so on, but also, of course, there's very different constituents. There's business lobbies, there's foreign policy and national security folk who see, I think, China very differently. Secondly, though, I think what happened since the COVID-19 crisis has been quite remarkable, because I think China has lost some of the goodwill, I think, that it had in Europe up until January, February. I think the diplomatic campaign that China engaged in Europe, wolf warriors and espionage and dangling coronavirus medical support for political support of its agenda, was received rather fiercely in opposition. And I think China made a mistake there. Now, is that to say that Europe will fall completely into the American camp? I don't think so, and that debate is certainly far from over. As I said, there are many different constituents. But certainly, I think many in Europe, also in the EAS and the Commission, see the EU, and that's also how the EU speaks of itself, as offering a different route. There's not only the United States and China, but there's also Europe. We also have values that we want to advance in the world. We are also a global power, and I think that narrative will try to stick. But on certain issues, I think yes, there will be a convergence rather with the Americans. I think there is, we do not have to fear, I believe, a large-scale decoupling. It's simply impossible, and no one wants that anyway. But in certain strategic sectors, as I said, and that I think will be narrowed down as we go further, what technologies we might not want to be connected because we do not share the same values and the same interests with the Chinese or the Americans, for that matter. There will be some sort of strategic decoupling that is maybe not driven in Europe, but certainly in the United States. And I think so, yeah, it won't be so easy to say, do we fall with the Americans or with the Chinese? I think, yeah, in some regards, there will be some disengagement from China, certainly in technologies, whereas in other fields, there's still a lot of goodwill and positive outlook that we need to engage also with the Chinese on environmental protection, climate change, and all these other global issues. But yeah, this will certainly, it already does, and it will certainly dominate Europe's debate around its role in the world for the next 3-5 years, no doubt.
Yes, again, it's a fascinating debate to watch, especially as we have these sort of references towards more geopolitical Europe playing a role, and it would be fascinating to see how that actually plays out. We had a number of other questions, but again, time is now running out, and we have to close the seminar. We at Bussola, of course, are very happy. Please contact us directly, and I'm also happy to entertain some of the questions and try to get an answer to those that we didn't have time to take on at this point. Guy, you wanted to have a quick word?
I just wanted to say I've answered a couple of the questions already, but
there you go.
I mean, but if there's, I mean, like you were saying, if there's a need, I mean, I'm happy to sort of do them by email if people.
That's great. That's great. No, that's fantastic. And that's always what we always offer here at the Institute as well. So looking forward to keeping in touch with everybody. Thank you for all your all your analysis and your interventions. Extremely interesting. I'll turn it over to John for some final comments.
Thanks a lot, Christian. And thank you so much to our three experts, as Christian has just been saying, Guy, Hasan, and Tobias, for joining us here today and for the very, very effective way in which you delivered your insightful presentations to us. I think that the webinar for me was engaging, informative, enlightening, and we are hugely grateful to each one of you for the time that you invested into making this webinar a success. I know that our large audience, which we have today, a very large audience, would probably have loved to hear much more from you had it not been for the constraints of time. But my sincerest thanks, of course, to that large number of attendees at today's webinar. And I look forward very much to welcoming each one of you back to future webinars, and indeed, and maybe more importantly even, back to Square de Muse in Brussels, when our face-to-face events can resume again in total safety, hopefully sometime after summer. A special word of thanks also to Christian and to the team, the entire team at Bussola, for their great support. I'd like to single one person out before we end, and that's Jihan. Jihan has been the person in the background there behind the Bussola Institute logo that you see on your screen. And she looks after the logistics, the technology, and literally everything to do with this series of webinars that we are running. So thank you, Jihan. So I'll finally end by again simply saying I'm so grateful to everybody, the speakers, the attendees, the staff of Bussola who participated in today's webinar. Thanks, Jihan. Thank you very much.